I had always been drawn to the macabre, but I never imagined I'd end up here, standing in front of an old, abandoned morgue at the edge of town. This place had been closed for decades, the doors left chained, windows broken and sealed. Whispers of its haunted history passed around like local folklore. I wasn't alone. Two friends, Dan and Lisa, had come with me. We were armed with flashlights, cameras, and a loose sense of bravery. The chilly autumn air hung thick around us, damp and unsettling. No one knew exactly why the morgue had closed, but rumors spoke of experiments and strange occurrences in the final years of its operation. We found a gap in the fencing and slipped through, reaching the rear entrance. The door, though wooden and heavy, hung partially ajar, as if inviting us in. I took a deep breath and pushed it open further, letting out a long creak that echoed through the hall. We clicked on our flashlights, casting harsh beams that barely penetrated the darkness. The smell inside was thick with mildew, dust, and something I couldn't quite place. A scent that seemed wrong for a place untouched for decades. The cold here was immediate, an unnatural chill that sunk through my skin and into my bones. Each step seemed louder than the last as we moved into the morgue's main hallway, feeling the weight of silence pressing down around us. We made our way to what we assumed was the examination room, following signs that had half fallen from the walls. The room was strangely untouched, almost preserved in time. An old autopsy table lay in the middle, rusted and discolored, with metal tools scattered around as if someone had left in a hurry. As I looked around, I saw faint scratch marks on the walls. They were thin and frantic, almost like someone had tried to claw their way out. Suddenly, I heard Lisa gasp softly. She'd found a set of cabinets with shelves lined with dusty glass jars. Each one contained something different, organs, it seemed, preserved in murky, oily fluid. Their labels had faded, but each jar seemed to carry an aura of decay and despair. Dan led us down another narrow hallway lined with refrigeration chambers, the doors hanging open. I shone my flashlight into one chamber, illuminating a small, cramped space with metal walls. My breath fogged the air as a heavy chill intensified in the corridor, almost as if the temperature had dropped suddenly. Just as I was about to step away, the door behind us creaked shut, slamming us into silence. Lisa and Dan whipped around, their faces pale. The flashlight beam flickered, and I heard a soft, distant hum, like a machine coming to life. It was impossible. The power was long cut, the generators probably stripped or rotted, but the sound was unmistakable. It was as if the morgue itself had woken up, aware of our presence. In the silence, there came a shuffling noise, faint but deliberate. It echoed from the room at the end of the hall, followed by what sounded like a faint wheeze, a ragged breath straining for air. Dan whispered, "Did you hear that?" And we stood frozen, our ears straining. The noise grew louder, a faint tapping sound, as if fingernails or some object was being dragged across metal. Every hair on my body stood up, my skin prickling with an acute sense of wrongness. I realized then that the noise wasn't random. It had a rhythm, a slow, steady pulse, almost like someone or something was counting. We decided to investigate the noise, moving toward a door marked with faint letters that once read locker room. The smell of dampness and rot grew stronger, making it hard to breathe. Inside, we found rows of lockers, many of them with doors hanging open. We heard it again, that scratching, louder now, coming from one of the lockers toward the back. I felt my chest tighten as I walked closer, almost hypnotized by the sound. I reached out, hand trembling, and pulled the locker door open. Inside was an old coat, its fabric rotting and frayed. But underneath, we saw something that made us all recoil. A handprint, pressed into the rusted metal as if it had been seared there. As we backed out of the locker room, something caught my eye in the hallway. Shadows, no figures, were moving at the far end, shuffling in and out of the flashlight's weak glow. They seemed hazy, as if they were half-formed, moving with a strange jerking motion that didn't seem natural. Lisa let out a quiet gasp, gripping my arm. The figures flickered in and out, then disappeared entirely. It was silent, but an overwhelming feeling of being watched pressed down on us, heavy and suffocating. We turned to leave, but the moment we did, we heard the sound of footsteps following us, heavy and unhurried. We froze. The only sound in the darkness was the echo of those steps, closer and closer. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was some trick of acoustics, but deep down I knew something was following us. Dan called out, his voice barely a whisper. "Who's there?" No answer. The footsteps stopped, but I could feel something right behind me, hovering just inches away. In a final burst of panic, we stumbled down a corridor and into a room that seemed to lead back outside. I nearly sagged with relief until I realized this was the embalming room. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with tools too specific, too sharp. A faint hum buzzed in the background, filling the air with an unsettling vibration. We didn't linger, pushing toward the back door. But as we reached it, the door wouldn't budge. I pushed harder, frantic, as the air grew colder. I glanced back at Dan and Lisa, and I knew they felt it too. Something, a presence, was in the room with us. As I strained against the door, a chill spread over my shoulder, something like a cold hand pressing down, holding me in place. My heart raced, my breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. Dan and Lisa were equally frantic, pushing, pulling, desperate to force the door open. Suddenly, Lisa stopped, her face pale as she turned to look behind us. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. I nodded, unable to speak. It was as if something heavy and unseen was bearing down on us, pressing the air itself against our skin. Then we heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakably real, coming from the far corner of the room. The voice was low, murmuring words we couldn't understand, a harsh, rhythmic chant that made the walls seem to pulse with a dark energy. "Stop. Please stop," Lisa muttered under her breath, her hands clamping over her ears. But the voice only grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with its maddening cadence. I felt myself getting dizzy, my vision blurring as the words seemed to twist around us, suffocating, inescapable. Just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the chanting stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. The air felt thick, charged, like the calm just before a storm. I shone my flashlight around the room, feeling the beam falter as it landed on strange symbols etched into the walls. Faint and faded, they were barely visible, but I knew, somehow, that they weren't just graffiti. Dan touched one of the symbols, tracing it with his finger. The room suddenly seemed to contract, a force pressing in on us. A shiver ran down my spine, and I knew we needed to get out. Whatever those symbols meant, they weren't meant to be disturbed. We hadn't noticed it before, but in the corner of the room stood an old, cracked mirror, its surface dark and clouded. I felt drawn to it, unable to look away, like something was calling me from within its depths. As I got closer, my reflection seemed wrong. It was still me, but with subtle, unsettling differences. A shadowed face, eyes that seemed too dark, too hollow. Dan and Lisa saw it too. Their reflections stared back at them with an unnatural intensity, as if watching us from somewhere beyond the glass. Then all three reflections slowly smiled, but none of us had moved. We turned back to the door, pushing with renewed desperation. The pounding grew more frantic, as if something on the other side was determined to break through. I could hear Dan muttering under his breath, fear choking his voice. The The door rattled and shook, but it didn't give way, trapping us between whatever was outside and the malevolent energy in the room. Shadows began gathering in the corners, flickering and shifting as though they had substance. They crept along the walls, stretching across the floor toward us, dark tendrils that seemed to writhe with purpose. We backed away, pressing ourselves against the door, hoping it would finally open. One shadow stopped at my feet, pooling around me. I felt the temperature drop, and a soft, whispered laugh filled my ears. It was as if the shadows themselves were alive, feeding off our fear, growing stronger as our panic set in. In a desperate attempt to escape, Lisa began pounding on the wall beside the door. Her fists landed on something that sounded hollow. She looked at us, eyes wide with a glimmer of hope. Together, we pushed against that section of wall, and with a reluctant creak, a hidden door slid open, revealing a narrow, pitch-black passage. We didn't hesitate. Ducking into the passage, we could feel the walls pressing close, the air thick with dust and the smell of rot. The small beam from my flashlight barely cut through the darkness, but we could see just enough to make our way forward, one trembling step at a time. As we moved deeper into the passage, we began hearing echoes. Not just our footsteps, but faint voices, snippets of conversation, like fragments of lives that had been trapped here. Laughter, sobs, urgent whispers. They filled the air, merging into a haunting chorus that seemed to come from all around us. I tried to block them out, but one voice rose above the others, speaking directly to me, calling my name in a slow, chilling whisper. I turned to see if the others had heard it, but their faces told me they hadn't. The voice spoke again, a sinister murmur that made my skin crawl. The corridor seemed endless, each turn leading us further from where we'd started. The flashlight beams started to flicker, the batteries dying, leaving us in near total darkness. I felt like we were walking in circles, each hallway identical, lined with doors that led to nowhere. At one point, we stopped to catch our breath, leaning against the wall. But as we did, we felt it. The wall itself seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a slow, unnatural rhythm. It was as if the building was alive, each pulse syncing with the rising terror in my chest. We reached a room filled with dusty, ancient medical equipment. Tables, syringes, strange metal devices that looked like they belonged in a torture chamber rather than a morgue. In the middle of the room was a table, covered in a sheet, something large lying beneath it. Against every rational thought, Dan stepped forward and lifted the sheet. Beneath it was a mannequin. No, it was more than that. Its eyes were open, glassy and lifelike, staring up at us as if aware. Its mouth, too, was partially open, and as we watched, it seemed to exhale a faint, cold breath. At last, we stumbled upon a staircase leading down, the steps worn and uneven. We had no choice but to descend, each step creaking beneath our weight. The air grew colder with every step, and the silence became oppressive, as if sound itself was swallowed by the walls. Just as we reached the bottom, a faint light appeared in the distance, flickering like a dying candle. It was our only option, so we pressed on, though every instinct screamed for us to turn back. We approached the flickering light, our footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The light revealed itself to be a single candle. Its weak, wavering flame cast eerie shadows, stretching across the walls like elongated, twisted figures. The shadows seemed to move, almost alive, pulsing in rhythm with the candle's flicker. Lisa clung to my arm, her grip tight and trembling. I could feel her terror, mirroring my own. As we stepped forward, inching toward the dim glow that felt both like a guide and a warning. As we moved closer to the candle, we noticed markings on the walls. Strange symbols carved into the stone, each one deep and dark, as if etched with purpose. Some of the symbols were familiar, resembling ancient protection symbols, while others were completely alien, twisted and contorted in shapes that defied comprehension. Dan ran his fingers over one of the carvings, his face pale. They're meant to bind something, he whispered. The realization made my skin crawl. Whatever these symbols were holding, it was powerful enough that someone went to desperate lengths to contain it here. As we continued, a low hum began to fill the air, vibrating through the stone walls and sending shivers through my entire body. It was a sound I felt in my bones, resonating deep and primal, like a warning. The hum grew louder, coming from somewhere just ahead. It felt oddly alive, almost like a breath, rising and falling, carrying with it a sense of anticipation, as though something on the other side was waiting for us to draw closer. At the end of the hallway, we found ourselves in a room filled with tall, tarnished mirrors lining both sides. Each one was cracked and cloudy, their surfaces mottled and warped from years of neglect. As our flashlight beams passed over them, they reflected ghostly shapes, distorted faces staring back with wide, hollow eyes. I tried not to look, but something in one of the mirrors caught my attention. I froze, my flashlight landing on a reflection that wasn't mine. In the dim, murky glass, a figure stood behind me. A pale face, expression blank and eyes dark, watching me with a cold, unsettling gaze. I turned, heart racing, but there was no one there, only silence. My friends, sensing my sudden fear, looked around nervously, their faces taut with dread. Each of us was now aware that someone, was moving with us in this dark, oppressive place. Just as we were about to leave, one of the mirrors cracked sharply, a splintering sound that echoed through the hall. The figure in the reflection seemed to smile, its teeth gleaming unnaturally bright in the fractured glass before disappearing altogether. We quickened our pace, desperate to leave the hall of mirrors, but the whispering began again, a faint chorus of voices that echoed off the walls, coming from every direction. It was impossible to tell what they were saying, the words overlapping in a low, sinister murmur. The shadows around us began to deepen, stretching out as if reaching for us. I felt something brush my shoulder, a cold, feather-light touch that sent a wave of panic through me. I stumbled forward, pulling Lisa and Dan along, the whispers following us like a haunting melody that refused to fade. We stumbled into another room, smaller and empty except for a single, ancient chair in the center. Its wood was cracked and splintered, and dusty ropes dangled from its arms and legs, as if it had once held someone there, bound and unable to escape. My throat tightened at the sight, a sense of foreboding overwhelming me. I could almost feel the suffering that lingered in this room, a heavy weight of despair that seemed to emanate from the very walls. As I moved my flashlight over the chair, I saw faint stains on the floor, long since dried and discolored, but unmistakable. Just as I turned away from the chair, I heard it, a voice, soft and chilling, whispering my name. It was unmistakable, yet distant, as though the speaker were somewhere just beyond the walls. My heart skipped a beat, my skin prickling with terror, as I realized it was the same voice I'd heard earlier in the hallways. Lisa and Dan stared at me, their expressions mirroring my horror. They hadn't heard it, but they could tell something was very wrong. I didn't know how to explain it, but I felt certain whatever was calling my name knew me. It wanted something from me. We pressed forward, moving out of the room with the chair and into a narrow corridor lined with chains hanging from the ceiling. They swayed gently, though there was no draft, their metallic clinks echoing eerily in the silence. The chains seemed to shift as we walked, some of them swinging out as if to block our path, others brushing against our shoulders in cold, unwelcoming touches. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were being controlled, manipulated by something hidden, something watching us from just out of sight. As we neared the end of the corridor, we heard it. A faint scratching noise coming from within the walls themselves. It grew louder, more frantic, like nails scraping against stone, desperate and relentless. We stopped, frozen, as the scratching moved closer, following us along the walls. The sound became unbearable, a maddening noise that seemed to claw at our minds. The sound was inside, echoing in my skull. With one final effort, we reached the entrance, shoving the door open with all our strength. We stumbled outside, collapsing onto the cold ground, gasping for air as we felt. I looked back at the morgue, my chest heaving, only to see that the front doors had shut on their own. And in the second-story window, the shadowy figure stood, watching us with a stillness that radiated both anger and sorrow.